Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring how human behaviour is influenced by incentives. Now, we're all familiar with the idea of rewards to encourage desired behaviour and punishment to deter undesired behaviour. It's something we've all experienced as children, but we also continue to experience it in our adult lives. Rewards are very, very common because they're incredibly effective. Yet, as we've seen in recent years, there are lots of examples where incentives end up delivering appalling results. One of the most obvious, and it's one I'm really familiar with, is the banking industry. We know what happens when enormous bonuses incentivize people to do things that are, well, frankly, not great. And it's that industry that I'm going to focus on. My guest is Bruce Rigal. He's a former colleague of mine from investment banking who, like me, has left financial services to move into the field of behavioural science. And Bruce was responsible, amongst other things, for developing an incentive program at a large bank, and so is ideally placed to help us explore the behavioural dynamics behind reward structures. Before we begin, since you're listening to the show, you will probably be interested in my book, Humanizing Rules, if you are in the business of influencing other people, particularly internally within organizations. Lots of insights in there as to how you can use behavioral science to do that more effectively. To read the first few chapters of Humanizing Rules for free, have a look in the show notes. There's a link to where you can do that. With that said, back to this episode, and what you're about to hear are some fascinating insights from inside financial services and some of the challenges of getting incentives right. How can we motivate people to do the right thing and dissuade them from doing the wrong thing? I think you're really going to enjoy this. Here's my discussion with Bruce Rigal on money and motivation. Bruce, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. And look, you and I go back some way, but for listeners that haven't come across you, give us a little pen portrait.
All right. Well, I sound American, but I'm actually grew up in Canada and went to business school at the University of Chicago in the late 80s and decided I wanted to become an investment banker. I don't think I really knew what that was or what that meant, but that's what I wanted to do. And when I was at business school, we had 20 lecturers, 19 of them were men. And there was one woman who taught us, who was a woman named Elke Weber, who taught us a course called Risky Decision Making, which was a precursor, basically, of behavioral economics. It's interesting. The University of Chicago likes to brag that it hired the first behavioral economist, Richard Thaler, but actually Elke was there before Richard and sort of paved the way. And she sort of taught this class about how people make decisions in reality as opposed to what neoclassical economics teaches us. And I loved the course. And, we wrote a paper. My buddy and I went to Las Vegas and wrote a paper about how people play craps, how they make bets in craps and whether they concentrate on the probability or the outcome. But don't ever actually multiply the two together, which is what you're supposed to do if you're making rational decisions in any kind of game of chance. And that sort of went on the back burner, and I went into investment banking, and I did equity capital markets for SG Warburg for many years, and then moved to Deutsche Bank, where I did equity capital markets, spent a lot of time in Central and Eastern Europe, back in the days when one could and when things were looking hopeful and promising, and did IPOs and bond issues and things in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and even Russia. And then eventually, maybe because of my background in MBA background and thinking about what motivates people and things, I took up a job as chief operating officer of the corporate finance division at Deutsche, and spent 10 years doing that and really loved it. We built a really good team. We worked well together. We developed a performance management system. I really loved the sort of being the coach in the background rather than the guy having to go out and win business, but trying to help manage the team from the sidelines. As a full player, but not sort of in the field as much. Uh, and that sort of ran its course. We overlapped there for a while. I then went to, I then sort of in 2014, I was approaching 50 and it was time to think about what was I going to do next. And I kind of felt I could either run up my career in banking or I could try to reinvent myself and do something different. So I came out and did some management consulting on my own around performance management at banks and other professional organizations. And then I discovered that, one man's experience in one shop doesn't really suit you well for taking a view on consulting. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back to university. And I remembered this class with Elke 25, 30 years earlier. And I looked around the UK. I'd met Richard Thaler and other behavioral economists, and I saw that Warwick University offers a really, really good program. So I signed up to do a master's degree, full-time master's degree at Warwick. I was every one of the other class members, they were all brilliant and lovely from all over the world, and they were all under 30, which was tough but fun. And it's interesting because I was sort of, at first I thought I'm going to be, I said to one of my friends, a guy I think I said, am I going to be, am I going to be the weirdo that nobody wants to talk to because I'm an old guy? Or am I going to be the guy that everybody wants to be friends with because I can afford to buy beer in the pub? And my friend David said, is the good news is you're probably going to be both. Which I was, which was fun. And that sort of taken me into teaching behavioral economics, behavioral finance, and having a real interest in trying to help people think about their personal financial decision making, and how can they avoid so many of the biases and things that you talk about in your book, uh, and really plan for their futures in a sensible way that takes account of their humanness as well as their economicus, if you know what I mean.
Love it. And you can just tell in the way that you talk about it, there's this sort of, I guess, passion it isn't necessarily the right word, but sort of curiosity about what drives human behavior that I think excites all of us that are in this field. And I want to take you back to that performance management system that you talked about, because I think if we looked at the banking industry, and of course, Deutsche Bank has a reputation that continues into the modern day for people doing, I'll be polite here, Bruce, interesting things. So talk us through that, because I'm fascinated. How do we, as we look at this industry, we know, and of course, some of this stuff was obvious with hindsight. Some of it, I think, perhaps even surprised people within the industry, the extent of some of the things that went wrong. But talk us through some of that performance management piece. How does one think about that when you're inside that kind of organization?
Okay. Well, I mean, and I'm going to talk about it, of course. I don't want to, pick on Deutsche Bank. I've worked for other firms as well and done other performance management systems. So I'll try to make it more generic, although the Deutsche Bank story is a very interesting one. I'd start with the main challenge that organizations have is they say one thing and then do another. And, this comes up all the time in your book, you know, zero tolerance for compliance errors, which, as you rightly frame, is the wrong way to be thinking about compliance anyway. But, they say one thing and do another. And the classic thing that banks do and most institutions do is each year the CEO gets up at the beginning of the year or after the annual general meeting and says, here are our goals. And our goals are about being the number one in the car rental industry, or being number one at the best airline in the world, as measured by clients. And then when they're finished that speech, which is very invigorating and motivational because they're good speech writers and they talk about values that we all believe in, they then go and hire outside management consultants to produce a performance measurement system, which usually measures revenues. How much money do you make? How do we split the pie? Now, with your background, if you say compliance is really important, and then you have a performance management system that pays people only for revenues, you know what's going to happen. people are going to sail closer and closer to the wind until finally their sails are flapping and their boat is sinking because they've sailed too close to you take the analogy too far. But I had a really great boss who had a vision for what he wanted to achieve. And we also, this is easy ex post to see, but we couldn't see ex ante. He had a long-term vision. He planned to be there for 20 years. He ended up being there. I took over as chief operating officer in 2000. He stayed for another 12 or 14 years. So we had a real run at producing some, we weren't being traded to another team. Uh, and that allowed us to build new systems. If I think about, you know, football analogies, we were given the chance to run the division for a long time, which meant we could really instill some new systems and things, which was interesting. So he's a Harvard MBA. I'm a Chicago MBA. Uh, he was very, very good at the touchy-feely, intuitive leadership stuff, and I was more the analytical, mathematical kind of guy. And that worked really well, that we could work together in that way. And he said at one point, I'm really tired of the way we do bonuses here. We sit in a big room and divide up huge amounts of money. And who's sitting in that room? And I'm not talking about any specific bank. You know who's sitting in that room 10, 20 years ago. It's a bunch of pale, male, stale men who might be smoking cigars if it was allowed, and they pay the people who've supported them, or who knows how oligarchies pay the group of people who are in their teams. And he said, "You're a smart guy, Bruce. Go produce a computer algorithm that we put all the data in and then it just pays people. And we'll make the algorithm right. And then we don't have to waste a month and a half at the end of every year not doing business, but deciding how to pay bonus pools." And that was sort of the start. That's not where we got to, thankfully, but we developed a system that helped measure people's performance in a sort of ranking kind of soft way around a whole bunch of different criteria that went well beyond revenues. And it worked. We built a spirit de corps, a division that reached its goals in terms of league table positioning. We aimed to be top 5 in corporate finance, which we did. And more importantly, we developed a culture where I feel that management was telling a story that was actually being put into practice by the actual actions that we took. We were to a large extent paying people for the goals that we'd set. And I can go into some of the detail, and you can guess what some of the things were and you can guess what some of the things weren't. And we did run into compliance problems eventually. And I don't think we ever figured out exactly how to measure risk on an individual kind of banker basis.
And it's interesting because I think one of the, speaking both as someone that has worked in the industry, but also stepped outside, the level of compensation in that industry is disproportionately high by any metric, right? The personal risk that people are taking, the societal value add, all those sorts of things. And undeniably, I think one of the reasons it's an appealing industry to work in is that clearly plays a major factor. In other words, lots of people are there because it pays well. They might enjoy what they do, but you can't disaggregate the compensation that's there. And that makes it quite challenging, I guess, when we look at it and we can see what impact the wrongly calibrated incentives can have.
That's right. That's right. And I don't think, I've worked now in universities, I've worked for a utility company, I've worked for different clients. I don't think people are that different. And, I don't think there are bad firms that hire bad people and good firms that hire good people, no more than I think that there are bad people and good people. I think it's contextual. It's the systems that you build and the designs that you make that determine how ordinary humans do good things or bad things based on the context in which they're in. I was attracted to investment banking because it sounded exciting, traveling all over the world. I knew it paid well. I didn't realize anywhere near how much it paid. Plus, when I started, it didn't pay as well as it did during those years in the 1990s and 2000s, which were the really, really big years. It's an industry that, particularly corporate finance, but sales and trading as well, where the payoffs are enormous and the difference between finishing first and second is huge. It's not like Wimbledon where the winner gets 100% of the fee and the runner-up gets 50% as much as the winner. If you run an IPO and you bring a company to market, an initial public offering, and the company's worth $100 million, which is quite a small IPO, and the fees on that are 5%, which is not out of the ordinary, particularly in the US, then there's a $5 million fee for running that piece of business. And if you come in second, you might get a couple 100,000 by being part of the underwriting team. But the book runner, the leader of the deal, does the vast amount of the work and gets paid a vast amount of the fees. So the competitiveness to win, the price for winning for the firm and the individual is huge, which is partly why I think the money is so high. The fees are high, the profits are high, and the difference between coming first or second is high. So you want the people who are going to compete at the highest levels. But then I think you're right. I think what happens is it flavors people's views. And I don't know if you're going to agree with this or not, but I think the money tries to solve a whole bunch of human problems that can't be solved by money. So, a classic thing that happens in banking is someone's disgruntled and has an offer from a competitor bank. And the manager wants to keep this person because they're a big revenue producer and they're the number one banker to British Telecom or something. And so the correct way of dealing with a disgruntled employee, and the way that almost all firms in the world will do it that don't have the kind of money that investment banking does, is you sit down with the employee and you say, let me hear you out. What are you not getting here? How can we improve the situation? What are your needs? And then solving the problem. Of course, what happens in banking is someone says, oh, XYZ competitors just offered him $1 million more. Let's offer him $1 million more here in terms of deferred stock, 5-year vesting deferred stock. And you convince the guy to stay because the $1 million, it's too difficult to move and the $1 million sounds pretty good. And now what do you have? You've tied in a disgruntled employee and you've not addressed why they were disgruntled. So the money produces huge problems in incentives because it becomes the only measure. And, it's funny. People always say, well, people are in investment bank. They're only there for the money. I don't think that's true. I think they get there for lots of reasons. And then you get told that the money is the reason you're there. And then eventually people believe it, in part because they're not managed as human beings and they're just managed as commodities based on money, the way football. We shouldn't use sports analogies all the time on your show. I'm sure you've been told that and I've been told that. But, did David Beckham try any less hard when he was playing for England than when he was playing for his club? When he was getting paid a fraction to play for his country for what he was being paid for his club? And the answer is no. He tried his hardest and risked getting injured and risked earning less money because that's why I think he played football because he enjoyed playing football, not because he thought he could become a millionaire by doing it.
And it's interesting, right? Because you could sort of say, well, if you shine on the World Cup, of course, that makes you more valuable. So it's not unhelpful.
Correct.
But I think the analogy is a good one. I think your analysis is, from my experience, is spot on. There is this perception, as you say, that everybody's in it for the money, and you become aware of that. But everything is driven by that, and your value proposition is determined. And you start benchmarking yourself. I think, and I found myself in that industry thinking that what by any standard were really good amounts of money landing in my bank account, and you sort of go, well, what's everybody else got?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And those sort of conversations, and in theory, you're not supposed to speak to anybody else about what they've got. Yeah, that's in the employment contract, right? But of course, those conversations happen, and you start to discover where you really stand. And I think everything is fixated on that point. I think that analysis around what do we do about something that's a human problem well, we'll just buy it out. We'll
Yeah.
just literally we will throw money at the problem to fix it. And I love that. I never really thought about the phrase, buy it out as opposed to hearing it out. But I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that. Completely chimes with my experience.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a interesting story, which is that we had one gentleman who I had a lot of respect for, who I'd worked with actually for 20 years because I'd worked with him at a couple of different firms. And he was one of these senior sort of vice chairman types who wasn't really in the bonus pool. He had a fixed salary, and he came in and helped. He was older, and he came in and helped us with clients as much as we could. And we gave him an office and support, and he helped us with business. And that contract was going to continue year to year until we felt it wasn't useful for us to have him around, or he felt it wasn't useful for him to be around. And it worked very well. Uh, but we decided, and this is an interesting technicality, we decided for various technical reasons in this performance management program that we would include him in the performance measurement system. Because the minute you didn't include someone, their revenues leaked into other people. It became a commodity, commodity that could be used. I was the reason this deal was won, but really Sam should get 100% of the credit because it doesn't help me in my. So we made sure there was no one that was above the performance management system. And one of the measurements was a small measurement was, how do you help with recruiting and talent development? Because again, the boss gets up at the beginning of the year and says, recruiting and talent development are critical to our path to become the number one European investment bank. So I said, well, if we're, I literally listened to his speeches and then wrote down what he said was important and then tried to figure out measurement systems that matched those things that he said were important. And he says recruiting them. So the first question is, how do I measure whether someone's good at recruiting and talent development? And the answer is, you ask the people who are responsible for that. You ask for human resources people. So I went to HR and I said, it's very interesting. HR is always complaining that they're not empowered and they don't have enough influence. And I go to HR and I say, so here's what we're going to do. You get to vote on who's been helping you doing recruiting and talent development. And you get to categorize people in 3 different groups. A people, those are the people who really help a lot and they're the ones who captain business school teams and run training programs in their spare times. They're the A's, and there shouldn't be too many A's. Then there's the B's who help when they're asked, and they're good people. And when you ask them to go to university, whatever, they'll probably do it. And then there's the C's who either say no, or you wouldn't want to ask in the first place because they'd be useless at it. And literally, and then out of these 5 points, we'd give the A's 5 points, and we'd give the B's 3 points, and we'd give the C's 1 point. We'd never give them 0 because that would be really demotivating. So you got 1 point just for being in the firm, right? Now, the first thing was, an interesting aside, is HR said, well, we don't know how to do this. And I'm going, I don't care how you do it. Just figure it out. And, and they got into a room eventually. And it's interesting because here you're offering them a chance to be really empowered, and they run away from it because they can't measure it, supposedly. But eventually they got in a room and they came up with the 10% A's, the 60% B's, and the 30% C's, and they gave us a measurement. Long story, this gentleman who's getting paid a fixed fee comes to me and says, Bruce, I want to get involved in recruiting. How can I get involved in recruiting? And I say to him, well, why do you want to get involved in recruiting? I mean, you're paid a fixed salary. You're one of the oldest people around here. You're the least connected to universities. That it was 50 years ago since you were at university, whatever. And what he said was, Bruce, you're producing a report card every year that measures 10 or 12 different things. And I keep getting a C for recruiting. And just like when I was in school, I don't like getting C's. I want to be on the team. I want to get an A. I want our mutual boss to think I'm an A in everything I do, the way I always have all my life. And therefore, I want to get involved in recruiting because it's important to the firm. It's important to how I see myself. It's important to how Management sees me, and there was literally no financial that I could see reward in him getting involved in recruiting, but he was incentivized. Imagine that you're at a firm where people are knocking at your door saying, "How can I help? How can I help HR?" You know, unfortunately, we didn't do as well with compliance and legal, but we did ask compliance and legal for input. And wouldn't you like to work in a firm where people are knocking at the door of the compliance and legal officers saying, "How can I help make this a better place? Because I want to get an A because I'm signed up on the team for helping do that." And that kind of thing happened, strangely, even amongst these bankers who only care about money.
I love the vocabulary around this, right? So compensation
Yeah.
is a great what we're compensating you for something. In the case of banking, you're gonna have to work long hours in some cases. There's always the risk of redundancy in part because of the way the cost base of the firms work.
Yeah.
So you've got compensation, but you've also got incentives. So we understand these things are used to drive behavior. And when you start to talk about it in those terms, what I think is really interesting is that on the one hand, the at a visceral level, these things are understood. But often, if you don't go through the sorts of exercises you're talking about, it's obvious you're going to get bad outcomes,
Yeah.
right? Because these things do work. We have to count it with the putting lots of money behind something does drive human behavior, or the risk of being fired if you don't perform in a particular way. That really does drive human behavior. So we know that, but very often these things are just miscalibrated, and that's where I think we get some of the
Yeah.
problems. So I guess your thesis would be it's not so much necessarily the high level of compensation, it's the structure that's behind it. It's what that then, the behaviors that
Well,
that then drives.
it's funny because I was once at a conference where I was pulled across. It was at the dinner when we had a few drinks at a conference, and I was pulled. One of the board members sort of beckoned me to come over to his table. And I sort of looked behind me. I'm thinking, I'm not that important a guy. Why is he beckoning me over? And I look behind me to see which person he's beckoning me over. And he looks at me and says, "No, it's you." And he comes over to me and he says, "How is it that you investment bankers get paid so much money? And do you think you deserve it?" And I couldn't really defend it. But what I said to him is, "Look, the bigger the bonus pool, the more money we can pay people to incentivize them to win more business. And if we try to win business, I certainly argued for bigger and bigger bonus pools. But again, it was relative, right? I argued relative to the other divisions, we should deserve to get paid more or closer to them, etc. To your point about no one cares about the actual level of pay. They care about whether they're treated fairly relative to everybody else." So my line to him was, "Look, let's hold back whether the pool is right or the amount of money is right. What matters is the ranking. What matters is, are you discriminating? Are you paying women less than men for the same job? Are you paying people who earn revenues at the expense of the balance sheet by lending money too much? Are you paying people who are breaking compliance rules so that they can win business with, what's the term that we use in the industry? Politically connected people." That's what I was more worried about, getting the ordering and the ranking and what we were paying people for right. So we spent a lot of time comparing the performance measurement ranking with the pay ranking, which means we never got to the point where my boss wanted, where we could pay people out based on a formula. Mostly because we couldn't measure risk, which, as you know, I use the company, use British Telecom as the example. If we had a banker covering British Telecom and Deutsche Bank or whatever bank you're working for is lending hundreds of millions, how do you measure the revenues that are earned with that client? To what extent are the revenues coming because you have a banking relationship and lending? And to what extent is it for the advice you're giving? We could talk about Thames Water, right? Thames Water, not surprisingly, paid a hell of a lot of fees to bankers to help them get as leveraged up as they were, which is now make certainly going to cause problems for taxpayers and may cause problems for customers of the biggest water company in the country.
Having stepped out of the industry, what's your perspective now when you look at it? Are you surprised by where we're at? Because if I look at the 2008 crisis, should have, by any sort of logic, have forced some kind of reset.
Yeah.
And things did happen, right? There were regulatory changes made. There's a greater focus on things like conduct.
Yes.
So I'm not saying nothing happened, but in some respects, we are still seeing some of those dynamics that are driven by the things that you were talking about occurring nowadays. And I wonder, what's your perspective on that, having stepped away from
I
it?
think uh, I think that's when I could back right back to you, because I think that's what you've been studying these last few years and consulting on. I think, there is some good things, right? The capitalization of the banks has gone way up. Looking at incentives and compensation is being scrutinized more. And I think the amount people are being paid has come down, and probably the distribution is narrow. It's still a very highly paid industry to be in. The top people are not getting paid hundreds of times what the bottom people were. So that some of those things are good, but the incentive to get the cover off the ball and get that contract for, you know, the national oil company of a country run by what ostensibly is a dictatorship is still there. I'm a behavioral economist. I think the problem is basically we hire in the banking industry people who have done economics degrees, done MBAs, and are taught neoclassical economic theory. And it's not, it's an interesting thing. And you know this from the behavioral experiments. One of the things you have to put on the right hand side of the equation when you're doing experiments about giving and dictator games or ultimatum games and trying to see whether people give more or less in different situations, one of the explanatory variables is, have they studied economics? And the reason is because if you study economics, you become more selfish because you're taught that's the way you're supposed to be. It's not true that economists are more selfish than it's not true that economists attracts people, I think, who are more selfish than non-economic subjects. But when you get there, you're taught to be profit maximizing, only utility maximizing, only caring about yourself, only caring about shareholders. No major employees of companies or even CEOs only care about shareholders. Of course, they care about the environment and whether their products are good and whether they're giving good service to clients and whether they're destroying the ozone, et cetera. I think those are all things that people naturally care about. But so I think the paradigm that's being used to run those institutions is still the same paradigm. It's the econ paradigm. And I'm using Richard Thaler's words here. He talks about econs and humans. And I think the vast majority of the leadership of these institutions is still in this economic framework that if I pay people more, they'll do more for me. And that if I don't pay people enough, they won't. And it, as in, I think again, most football players become football players because they like football and they try their hardest every game they play. And if they're disincentivized, it's about the management of the team and how they're being treated by their colleagues and their managers. That's what incentivizes you to play well in a football team is, does your manager believe in you? Do your colleagues believe in you? Do you believe in them? It's much more. And I don't think we give lip service to those kind of things, but I still don't see that many managers who manage that way. I mean, one thing you could do is pay everybody the same, right? You get paid to join my investment bank. We'll pay you $1 million a year. That's all you'll get paid. You won't get paid more or less, and you better produce because if you don't produce, we'll fire you. That might be a nice model to run a bank because then everybody's in it together for doing it for each other and the firm rather than beating the guy who's sitting at the desk beside you. But neoclassical economics teaches you one thing, and yet us humans make our decisions based on trust, feeling good about ourselves, getting paid fairly compared to the guy sitting beside us or the woman sitting across the hall, etc. And it's interesting. I think business schools are learning this. Chicago Booth, where I went, now has a lot of sessions talking about stakeholder value and how do you balance shareholder value with society and things. And they are the home of neoclassical economics, right? Milton Friedman, etc. And they've come to understand this. But I'm not sure that most firms are still looking for that golden incentivization program that's going to get sales to go through the roof.
And it strikes me as you're talking, I mean, what we're talking about here is a model. And of course, we know that models come with flaws. And as I think about the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century, if I look at political systems, if I look at the way the banking system operates, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of these things, we can question whether they were ever fit for
Yes.
purpose, but I'm not sure they're fit for purpose in the 21st century. And hence we've got groupthink because we're not allowing different perspectives in. We've got people incentivized to think either short term when long term thinking would be more appropriate. And so all the things you're talking about here, we can look at and say that the model's broken in
Yeah.
many respects. And what you're pointing towards, I think, is it's broken in the sense that it doesn't incentivize people to do the things that we all kind of intuitively know that we want from them and that we would expect from them. And these things are just allowed to perpetuate. And so I guess, and until we have a clear down, which is, brings me back to that question about 2008, which is that was a moment when you might have thought, well, someone's going to step in and go, time to change
Yeah.
this. Because if we don't change it, we're going to get the same issues arising again. And so what I think we've done is tweak the model as opposed to looking at the fundamentals of it.
Yeah.
But it's symptomatic of this broader piece, isn't it? The political system that's not working and many other processes that aren't really delivering. Yeah, it works well for the people that it works well for.
Yeah.
It certainly doesn't seem
No,
to work
that's
well
right.
for broader society.
That's right. And it's the classic, you know, externalities that we were taught in economics that, the fact that companies don't have to pay for the pollution they put into the sky and the fact that politicians, you know, it's funny. I spend quite a bit of time with young people, both students and my kids, and young people vote less than older people. And part of that's because they don't believe the system works, right? They just don't, they think that politicians are bad and people who work for government are bad and only in it for themselves. Now, you and I were reintroduced to each other by a mutual friend who's a lovely, brilliant banker that I worked for, who now works for the Bank of England, right? Uh, and he's only trying to do what I know he's a good guy and trying to do what's good for the world and use his intelligence and his experience for the good. Uh, but there's this huge distrust. But part of that's this political system where, what's the incentive to address climate change when there's an election in a year and a half and people can't pay their fuel bills, right? That this is, and I just don't know. The externalities today seem to be greater than they've ever been. Although we have fewer wars than we used to have. We know about the wars that we do have, but fewer people are dying from wars than in most time in our human history. So we do seem to have been progressing in some ways, but in other ways, we can't progress. And I'm not, benevolent dictatorship's probably the best way, but even if the person's benevolent when they start, by the time they've been in power for 5 years, they're no longer benevolent, right? So I don't have a solution for that. And then we get into the whole social media that incentivizes us to either be hugely pro Brexit or hugely anti Brexit or hugely pro this or that. And, when most people are in the middle, they know that issues are difficult and all the rest, but our systems, and that's not one person's fault. That's kind of the way our society's developed. No one's pulling the strings. We are what we are, and it is broken. I think you're right.
Your career is this nice arc where you've returned back. And I think this happens to a lot of us. You sort of, you not to say that you stepped away entirely from it, because I think the way you talked about your banking career, clearly that interest in people, wanting to work with high quality people, building systems and processes to support that. I mean, it's very much in your DNA. But you've beautifully come back to and are now focusing on the thing that got you started in the first place. And I wondered, your reflections of Bruce in a parallel universe. Would you, if you were starting again, would you still go into
Yeah.
banking? Would you focus on the behavioral side? What would your thoughts be there?
That's a really good question. I don't, you know, I have kept in touch with a few old professors and friends from from business school, and there was one very guy named Sam Peltzman. I don't know if you remember, if you've ever heard of Sam Peltzman. Is an economist at Chicago who probably should win a Nobel Prize, but probably his days are past now. He was the guy who said when seatbelt legislation, for some of our listeners won't believe that there was actually a day when you choose to drive in a car without wearing a seatbelt. And in the back seats of most cars didn't have seatbelts at one point. And in the 60s in the US, they started to talk about seatbelt legislation, and they were going to enforce seatbelt legislation. And some group of scientists went off and decided that X many people's lives would be saved by enforcing seatbelts. And the way they did that is the classic way of looking at all the accidents, seeing what percentage of deaths there were, doing engineering studies with those crash test dummies to see who would have survived the similar accidents, etc. And they came up with X, and X was in the tens of thousands, right? Seatbelts are going to save 82,453 lives or whatever they came up with per year. And Peltzman was the guy who came out and said, no, they won't. And he said, well, what do you mean? We've done all the science. You're just an economist. He says, no. He says, people are going to drive faster when they're wearing seatbelts, and the risk of, they're going to compensate for the risk by driving faster, right? Because they're going to feel safe. Also more pedestrians are going to die, because if you're a pedestrian, you actually want drivers not to wear seatbelts because, then they have skin in the game, right? They hit you, they're going to suffer too, not just you. So there's all these behavioral things. Anyway, that's the story of Peltzman, it's called the Peltzman effect, about risk mitigation. But he taught me industrial organization in 1987, and I loved his class. He's now an old man, and I was at Chicago booth about 5 years ago, and I walked past the door of this old man sitting behind a desk, and I go, oh my gosh, that's Sam Peltzman. And I think I should go say hello to him. And then I said, he doesn't want to see me, he's working. I'm not important. And then I went to see the guy I was supposed to see, and he wasn't in his office. So I went back and got up the guts and knocked on the door and said, Professor Peltzman, can I speak to you? And he said, sure, come on in. And I said, I'm Bruce Rigal. I took your class in 1987, and it's my favorite class of all time. And you set me on my life, and you're wonderful. And it was fantastic. And it's so glad to see you. And I'm so thankful. And he looked up at me and he said, so Bruce, tell me what you've achieved since we first met in 1987.
It's a good question.
And I, you can imagine what my answer was. Blah, 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 trying to come up with a few, I made a lot of money. Oh, really? Is that something you should be proud of? So to get to your question, it's been great. I've loved it. And I've got to watch I've got to travel all over the world. I've worked with fantastic colleagues. I've seen great things. I've seen terrible things. Would I do specific things differently? Yes. There were things in the credit crisis that I sort of kicked myself for, where there was an intuitive feeling that things were wrong, but I was looking in the wrong places, and my colleagues were looking in the wrong places. And, but no, I think, like you, having worked in the industry for a long time, it's an exciting place to work. They're lovely people, smart people. It's energizing. There was an energy of walking into the buildings and seeing colleagues, right from the security people up to the most senior people. It was the whole place. And now in teaching and consulting, and I hope writing, I can bring together this sort of the academic world and, the real human world that you and I, busted our guts in.
I love that question. And you've now made me very nervous
Yes.
about going back to speak to academics that once taught me, because the same question will be, I can turn around to them and say, well, what have you been doing? Right. So there's a legitimate of a same job you were doing then, huh? How's that progress? So there is this, but I think it's an interesting point. And I definitely wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now and in some ways this is a statement of the obvious, if I hadn't gone through the experiences I've gone through in the past. And sometimes that was experiences of systems and processes that made little sense at the time. But now you look back and go, what the hell was that? But equally, things that did work well. And so when I look back on what did I learn from the banking experience, I think it's some of these lessons about, well, what does money do to people?
Yeah.
I think is interesting. And in particular, what does it do to me and how's my behavior changed? And so when you look at, how much money do you need to be happy? I think my answer to that question now, partly because I'm older, but also because I've stepped out and done something else, it provides a useful benchmark and comparator. And I think it's really interesting thinking back to what would my perspectives have been before I went into this process and how's my view of the world changed. And I think you're a very clear example of somebody that's sort of very reflective on the experiences you've been through. And that's almost driving the mission that you're on now in the loosest
Yeah,
sense.
I think that's right. And yet, and Daniel Kahneman talks about this, being aware of all these things doesn't change your own behavior, right? He was asked, okay, you've been studying biases and heuristics and framing effects for all your life. Are you a better decision maker today? And he says, no, I fall into all the same traps. I flew on an airline recently, a certain large discount airline that might have some guesses of who it was. And I paid to check a piece of luggage, and I went up to a kiosk that didn't work. Now, that kiosk supposedly had a sign that said it didn't work that I missed seeing. And basically the kiosk wouldn't spit out the luggage tag, and it said, go stand in the lineup over there. You now have to go stand in the lineup and check your luggage manually. Now, of course, this was an hour before the flight was taking off. And I quickly measured how quickly the lineup was moving forward, and it was moving forward at less than the number of people in front of me in an hour. So I was going to miss my flight. And I was furious. How unfair is this? And then it took me a long time to come to the correct neoclassical example, which is go back to one of the kiosks that works and purchase for 40 quid or 50 quid another suitcase so you can check your suitcase and go on your little trip and enjoy yourself. And you and I are lucky enough at our stage in life that 50 quid, you could spend 50 quid on a bottle of wine, right? It isn't going to make the difference in our lives. But I went through fury about having to, the loss aversion, as the behavioral scientists talk about, of having to pay, and the unfairness and the distrust and all the rest. So yeah, these humanistic things really affect our lives, and we need to think about how we could design systems. And your humanizing rules book is exactly that. You're taking what you've learned from the real world with some of the theory and put it together to really help people and help people who want to do good things, right? And most people do. I do want to just quickly tell one other story, which is an experiment, which I think you know about, which is with the kids and the sweets. And
Yeah. Go for it.
There's this old experiment where you put kids in a room, 3-4-year-old children, and there's like 10 different stations of games. And what you're trying to do is get the kids to go to as many of the different stations as possible, playing with different games, because it provides more variety in their life. There's more learning opportunities, etc. You want kids to experiment with different things so they'll learn more. So it turns out that if you put kids in a room and there's these 10 different games, on average, they go and they play with 5 of them. So that's the average. And then some teacher comes up with a brilliant idea. Let's incentivize them. Intrinsically, they want to play with 5. That's the average number. So then some teacher says, let's extrinsically motivate them. Let's give them some pay for playing with more games. So they give the kids a sweet for every time they change to a different game. And so you pay them sweets, and guess what? The number of different games they play with increases. So extrinsic pay works. Paying kids sweets to play with different games works. Paying bankers to go sell more deals works. Then one of the other teachers says, okay, well, we've run out of sweets. Let's see what happens now. We'll take the sweets away. They take the sweets away. And what's really interesting is the number of games the kids play for doesn't just drop to 5, it drops to 4 or 3. So what's happened, and you know this from behavioral science literature, is extrinsic incentives has overshadowed the intrinsic desire for the kids to play the games in the first place. So now that they're not given the sweets, they do even less than they would have just naturally. And that's what a lot of our systems are doing. They're I call it the fire in the paper basket syndrome. We spend so much time designing systems and compliance systems and, job descriptions. I don't know if you talk about it in your book about job description. I hate job description, right? You will do this and you won't do this and you will do this. And, 17 pages later, you've described what Sam's job is. And then he starts that job and he never looks at the job description again. And he quits or gets fired. And then his boss needs to hire someone new who then goes and dusts off the job description. But for example, and I never saw this happen. And I never saw this specific thing happen in action, but you and I both saw it in a compliance sense happen. An employee walks into the building and they see that there's a fire in the waste paper basket. What should they intrinsically do? And the answer is try to put out the fire or break the glass, right? We even have a sign that says what we should do if there's a fire in the waste paper basket. But what in our modern life do people do? They look at their job description and say, well, I'm not paid to put out fires. I'm paid to win deals for British Telecom. So they walk past the fire in the basket. They don't tell anybody. They don't ring the alarm. They don't try to put it out themselves because we've defined what they're supposed to be motivated to do, and it doesn't include this. And I think humans, if left to their own devices, and that's such a great theme in your book, mostly will do the right thing. So you incentivize them to do the right things that they naturally want to do. And you not incentivize them, but you make it easy for them to do the things that they really want to do. You're most of the way there. And then you could just deal with the real bad eggs as opposed to the contextual bad behavior you produce in the good eggs.
Love it. I think, Bruce, that is an amazing insight. And it's kind of obvious, but I think it's always worth refreshing. I thought you were going to say their job is to start fires, not put them out. But it's in some cases, I think is true. But as listeners will have gleaned, I love speaking to you because I think you bring a passion and an interest for a subject and have tons of experience of it in the real world and the academic background as well to be able to fuse all these things together. So it's been an absolute pleasure. If people want to get hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn. It's Bruce Rigal. My last name is spelled Rigal. And my first name is spelled the way Bruce is always spelled. And as far as I know, there's no other Bruce Regals out there because my last name's a bit unique. So look me up on LinkedIn and send me a message. I'd love to talk to people about, their work challenges and their, anything. As I said at the beginning, one of my favorite things is why is it that some of our friends who've had exactly the same careers as we have are bankrupt and other friends are living the good life as they get older? And a lot of that's about human behavioral challenges.
Love it. I will put a link to your LinkedIn profile for the people who don't have a pen or a keyboard in the show notes, as well as to some of the things that we've talked about. But Bruce, all that remains to say is thank you so much for all the things that you do, the teaching that you do, but particularly for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you. I've loved it. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Bruce for appearing and to you for listening.
To find out more about Bruce, his work, to connect with him, and some of the topics that we talked about on the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. There's also a link in the show notes to my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, which really, as we mentioned on the show, touches on many of the subjects that we talked about. If you want to read the first few chapters of that for free, you can do that by following the link in the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for listening. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review from wherever you get it, please do so. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thank you so much for listening.